Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, January 27th, 2026 at 9:10 in the morning. So we're beginning our week with H205, which is an act relating to agreements not to compete. And this is a strike all amendment that our legislative counsel, Sophie Zidek, has been putting together for us, and she's ready to walk us through it. So, Sophie, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. So Sophie Zidatny for the Office of Legislative Counsel. And just to sort of set the scene, there were two bills last session. So one was H205 that was in this committee. One was H334 that was in General and Housing. And what I was asked to do was essentially sort of combine the two. So this is a strike all amendment to H205. And I did a little chart just to make it easier for folks to see. Although you never had the walkthrough on H334, the reason I've included it is because what the strike all amendment does is it strikes out section 1 of H205, which was dealing with franchise agreements, and it adds in the final section from H334, which dealt with stay or pay provisions. So, and then it just lists out on the right-hand column just what the main changes are. So I will go through that with you if I have permission to go ahead and share my screen. Is that large enough for folks to see? Yeah, okay. So this would essentially add, this strike all amendment would add two new sections to Vermont's Fair Employment Practices Act. So it would add them at 21 VSA 495, and then this would be, I think we're on R and Q, whatever. Anyway, it's adding Q and R. Yes, we're way down the alphabet. So the first section deals primarily with agreements not to compete, and the second section deals with stay or pay provisions. So this first section here is new. This sets forth the legislative intent and provides that it's the intent of the General Assembly to discourage the use of agreements not to compete except in rare circumstances, where the agreement is the result of bargain for exchange that furthers legitimate commercial interests. The second sentence here is essentially to rule out agreements not to compete with the lowest paid workers, hourly workers. So it provides agreements not to compete between an employer and a non-exempt employee under the Fair Labor Standards Act, are presumptively coercive and a restraint on trade. So the reference to the FLSA was passed in 1938. It provides at the federal level the minimum wage, overtime, child labor restrictions, and the provisions that when it says non-exempt, that means that employees that are non-exempt are entitled to receive overtime. And again, those tend to be your hourly workers and the lower paid workers. I just flag that again, if that is the legislative intent of this committee. There are other states do things other ways. They have, 200% of the minimum wage, an amount over the federal poverty level. There are other ways you could frame this, but I included non-exempt employees, which is another route that other states have used. Going into this, the agreement not to compete, this language is the same. It hasn't changed from when it was in 205. Essentially, an agreement not to compete is one that restricts employees after they leave a position from working, and then with these things, working for another employer for a specified period of time, working in a specified geographical area, or working for another employer in a capacity similar to the one that they were working in before. And then there's what an agreement not to compete is not. So it's not an agreement that prohibits the disclosure of trade secrets. It's not a non-solicitation agreement, and that's defined further down. And then it adds in, this strike all amendment adds in a definition of executive employee. We will get to the reason for that in a moment, but essentially this is, there's a wage threshold in here that permits agreements not to compete. So it's a wage threshold plus job function, and the job function relates to executive employee. So executive employee is defined here as a senior executive at the highest level of the employing entity with access to proprietary information critical to the employer's business interests. So again, this is retaining the 100,000 wage threshold that was in the original H205. I know there was concern that has been raised around startups. So it might be possible to reframe this in terms of lower amounts on the wage threshold, but still targeting those people that are at the very center of the business and have that critical information that's so important to a new startup.
I don't know, we may want to do this after, but could we do something where it's a percentage of the gross sales of the company or something like that?
Yeah,
Some sort of a percentage. I've seen that done in other situations. You have key people and it helps the startups because, you know, you may only be making $50,000 a year, but you'd still be a key person if you were taking half that for your salary.
yeah. I mean, there are ways to play with. So this is the concept that's in. Is it would be permitting agreements not to compete, but again, it's trying to rule out sort of the lower paid folks and the ones that really don't have access to critical information to the company while still protecting those where you do have a key employee that's at the very center of a startup.
Yeah, I feel like should be connected more to non-exempt or exempt employees, right? Like if you can't put your employee in salary, then you really shouldn't be doing non-compete.
So that's what's covered in that original, that the legislative intent where it references the non-exempt. It's basically saying no to you cannot be doing this for non-exempt employees.
Sophia, on that definition, when you say a senior executive at the highest level of the employing unit, to me, that just spells out the CEO. But I think we're looking at, levels down below the CEO as well.
Well, again, that's, up to, I think the goal here was to capture like your chief information officer, your chief technology officer, someone that's central to who may have a big title, but a very low salary when you're starting up. So that's just the concept. Again, there could be adjustments moving forward. The non-solicitation agreement. So again, these would be permitted. And essentially, again, the subdivision 3A here is not really a change. Just those are agreements where when you leave, you're not going to solicit or recruit the employer's employees or solicit business, with the customers or clients of your previous employer. This does take out the language. Before it was solicit or transact business. So this takes out the or transact language because there was concern around what that would mean in terms of, actually working, if a customer chooses to follow a departing employee, it would then be transacting business with them. So it took out that language. And then this adds in this subdivision B. So notwithstanding A, it shall not be a violation of a non-solicitation agreement for a separating employee to provide notice of the employee's change of employment to clients with whom the separating employee had a direct attorney-client, patient medical provider, or fiduciary relationship. So in other words, if you're the lawyer, the doctor, the accountant, whatever, that you can at least notify the folks that you previously worked with that you've had a change of employment. Severance agreement is not changed in this from what was in H205. There wasn't a definition of severance agreement in the original H334. Again, subsection C, the prohibition, that is still the same. But then you get into the exceptions. So again, an agreement not to compete is void and unenforceable, but then you have the exceptions listed out below. And these are not changed. The sale of substantially all of the individual's ownership interest in a business or operating assets, dissolution of a partnership, dissolution of a limited liability company, or a severance agreement. And again, the severance agreement has limitations on it. So again, these are the same limitations from before. So again, the time provided further that the limitation on time cannot exceed the number of weeks or months of pay, however appropriately calculated, that the employer offers to the employee in consideration to sign the agreement, the geographical area and the scope of activity to be restrained. The wage threshold, again, is not changed. It still is at $100,000, but it adds in again, the prohibition does not apply to an agreement not to compete between an employer and an executive employee to whom the employer pays $100,000. So again, there's those two, it's job function and wage threshold is the current test on that. The same notice piece as before. And then this adds in subdivision 2B here, that the employer may rescind the offer within 3 business days if the employer discovers information about the prospective employee that supports rescission of the offer. So there was a concern before that, you know, you have to give notice to an employee if you're expecting them to sign an agreement not to compete. And the language was that you couldn't rescind that within 3 business days. And there was a concern, well, what if in the course of due diligence, you find something out about the prospective employee and you do want to rescind it? So this additional language in this sentence here allows that rescission if the employer discovers some information that would support rescission. The employee rights is not changed. Again, these are the non-retaliation provisions in the Fair Employment Practices Act and the penalty and enforcement provisions in the Fair Employment Practices Act. So that's all the non-compete stuff. So it's there if anyone has any other questions on the non-compete. So the second section that would be added to the Fair Employment Practices Act is to do with stay or pay provisions. This is new. This is not what was originally in H205. This comes over from H334. And again, this would limitations on those kinds of agreements. And again, this is looking at situations I'm not aware of, and I'm not sure the group that looked at this were aware of situations specifically to Vermont. But nationally, there have been situations where lower paid employees are required to sign these stay or pay agreements. And then if they're terminated for any reason, they can be asked to repay the employer like $5,000 or something. And it makes it very hard for employees to move particularly if they're in an abusive work situation. So this language is defining what stay or pay provision is, can take many different forms, training repayment provisions, educational repayment contracts, quit pleas, damages clauses, sign-on bonuses, etc., that an employee must pay an employer in the event the employee leaves voluntarily or involuntarily. And then in B, it says it shall be unlawful to require an employee to pay the employer pursuant to one of those agreements following their separation, and then notwithstanding that, then these are the exceptions. So it is acceptable to have a stay or pay provision if the employee voluntarily, and these are so you have to have all of these. The employee voluntarily agrees to the provision in exchange for a benefit. The repayment amount is reasonable and does not exceed the cost to the employer of the benefit received by the employee. The repayment amount is specific and provided to the employee before the employee agrees to the provision. The length of the stay period associated with the provision is reasonable, and then there are some factors associated with that. So the cost of the benefit bestowed, the value of the benefit to the employee, can they take it and use it somewhere else? Whether the repayment amount decreases over the course of the stay period, and the provision does not require repayment if the employee is terminated without cause. Again, there is in some states, terminated without cause, it might be just terminated involuntarily. It could be a layoff, it could be, or terminated for any reason. So again, these are all things that can be reviewed. But these are factors in terms of, is it reasonable? So again, if normally these kinds of agreements, it has to be of a benefit to the employee that the employee can transfer somewhere else. It should be something that's voluntary, so the employee could choose not to do the training or the education. It's not critical to their current job. So those are just examples of the stay or pay. And then again, same language as before in terms of no retaliation, again, under the language that's currently in the Fair Employment Practices Act, and then the same penalty and enforcement provisions.
Just for clarification, if I'm an employee and my employer sends me to a safety training so that I can be the trainer for the facility, that would not be something that they could
couldn't ask you to repay that, right?
ask me to repay that.
Right, because they're asking you to do that for your job. That's something you need to do for your job. So these are more things where
But if I wanted to get my bachelor's degree and the employer had a provision where if I had worked there for a certain amount of time, they would pay for that. And I can use that to go anywhere.
right.
then I could be held responsible to pay them back as long as the amount decreased over time.
Right,
But that's the piece that I.
essentially, as long as it's reasonable. So these are examples of what would make it reasonable. So they couldn't charge you more than whatever the cost to them was. So if it was costing them, say, $10,000, they couldn't charge you more than that. The amount is specific, so you know that going in, like, we're going to help cover your education costs, but this is the cost. And so you're aware of that. And then the repayment decreases. So for example, if you stay for 5 years, maybe it just goes down, you know, right? Some sliding scale where the longer you're there, the less the repayment would be. But if you were to immediately leave, then the full amount.
Thank you.
Question percolating in there, though.
A little bit. I'm just going through my head. How could you enforce something like this? You know, I go get a job with an employer. I take a couple of classes in college, 10,000, say they pay $10,000. And then I'm like, yeah, I found a better job. How are you going to get that money out of me? You can't garnish my wages. I just don't see, I think it makes sense, but I just don't see how it can be enforced.
So people sue. I mean, people get sued. And again, depending on the amount, if it's a minimal amount, then you're going to weigh the value of doing that. But there definitely are horror stories that have been out there in the media in terms of people being charged significant amounts. So again, you then have the cost and expense both for the employer and for the departing employee.
Yeah.
So people have sought to enforce them.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's a real issue we have here in Vermont. We have these, we have all these companies that invest money to train people and then they get a job out of state because they get paid more and it's less expenses. And so I think there's a need for something like this. I don't know.
I would take the opposite. I feel like you're going into a contractual relationship and disclosure's important and understanding it, but to regulate it out, I'm not. I mean, that is a lot of money. If an employer is willing to pay $10,000 for an education and then you up and leave, that's a huge problem.
Right, which is the purpose of.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'm just, in general, like, I'm not very comfortable regulating the no compete. I think that's what my issue is. Could no compete, just the contractual. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's pretty hard as far as the no compete. I mean, if you're non-exempt, you can't sign it. And I think there's a lot of checks and balances. Maybe we need to tighten that down. But I think you had mentioned that last one, there should be a non-compete should be the exception, not the rule. Especially when we have no solicitation clauses and you have, all these other different things that can offer the same level of protection, but still give that person the right to get a job.
I also think it's different the type of employee you are. There are plenty of employees, setting aside the wage level, I think, who are pretty sophisticated in terms of how they go into something. And then there are a lot of folks that are not and don't really have the ability, I guess, to bargain for.
Yeah. And you get into the weeds with if you're talking about those higher positions, like you had mentioned, CEO is there, but after that, it could be anything. I mean, depending on a company's makeup, you can have a VP, you can have a director, you can have all these different job titles. And, if we were to say, okay, well, you have to, if you're a CIO or CFO, well, then you just change the title to something different and then they can evade the law.
I don't know. So if you talk about that, I don't think it would be that easy to evade the law there. The definition talks about access to proprietary information critical to the employer's best interest. So Yeah, I mean, there could be a lot of folks in the company that fit that description. I wouldn't see it as applying to, you know, floor manager or something like that, no matter what the title they have.
Right.
But that's just my take on it.
Jonathan?
Good morning. My question pertains to sort of establishing $100,000. How does the legislature typically account for inflation? Is it benchmarks? Can you hear more about that?
Yeah, so the $100,000 was in the original H205 bill, but again, as I noted, there are other states have done it in terms of like a percentage of, you know, a multiple of the federal poverty level or minimum wage or something, so that that would then move, you know, accordingly. So there are other approaches that could be used rather than a flat amount because, yeah, over time, do you then come back and revisit it? Do you put in an inflator in the bill? So yeah, I think there are different approaches. So it doesn't get out of date.
And in terms of defining some of the key personnel, had other states use terms around like directors or those covered by like DNO? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, there are definitely other states that do the same thing in terms of you can't have them for non-exempt employees. And then it varies. I mean, there's a bill currently pending in New York that has like a $500,000 cash compensation measurement in it. So states go in different directions. There are different, again, there's a whole variety, and I think that was in the report that was shared with the committee of wage thresholds in other states. And again, you're trying to balance between having a wage that's high enough that you're, you know, that it's only going to apply to more senior people, but at the same time, then how do you address a startup or a small business? And that's where the notion of job function comes in. So yeah, I mean, I can certainly look and see. I don't remember off the top of my head if there's specific language that folks have used around those positions, those senior executive positions.
What if we were to do like a percentage of payroll? Because it seems to me like your highest paid people, they're gonna be, you know, like you say, like up 10% of the payroll or something like that. Would that be a better way to tackle it? I'm just throwing an idea out here, really.
I mean, it could be. I don't know how easy it would be to draft something that would, you know, that would stop people from playing games around it or that would capture what you're looking for. But it's certainly something that, yeah, could be looked at.
So why don't, instead of throwing hypotheticals out, why don't we wait until we get some testimony from the business community and maybe we can find people that have suffered under non-competes to better understand the dynamics there and maybe understand a little bit better about this state of pay. What kind of issues people have run into there as well. That might be easier on us, but once we start hearing it, we can start generating some thought. Don't know that we're ever gonna get to a complete okay from everyone, but let's see if we can get to a point where people can live with everything.
One question, when we write laws, legislative intent is separated out from the law, right? That's our white books and our green books.
You can do it different ways. You can have it in session law, or you can have it specifically in the statute. And the request here was to put it specifically in the statute, so it remained in there, and that's not unusual. But you could,
That's my concern.
yeah, you can do it either way. There are legislative findings that are session law that are just there as legislative history if people go back. I think the goal here was to express right up front that the intent was that these be used rarely and that they not be used for the lowest paid workers.
Lots of questions, but they're not for you.
questions on the language, Michael?
My ignorance, would this cover teachers?
In what way?
Because it's my understanding, and I'll look over there. If a teacher quits midstream, the teacher cannot go to another district. That's not correct? Thought there was like some.
They have to just, if they want to get out of the contract,
Huh?
they have to get permission to get out of their contract.
Right, that's what I mean. And if they don't get permission out of their contract, they cannot work at another school. Would this apply?
It's a contract.
It's a contract, okay.
Good contract, good.
Yeah,
But
the-
this is a union contract.
okay,
It's a, yeah, this doesn't get in.
just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, that is,
It's a
yeah, the
different
question for
contract.
Sophie, right?
Yeah.
Collective bargaining, this doesn't impact that, or this doesn't?
It does, I mean, it doesn't address it directly, but, you know, I think I'd have to look into that specifically, but I mean, I haven't seen anything in looking at this across the country where there's been discussion around, well, how would this interact with teachers' collective bargaining agreements? And again, you'd notice you're voluntarily entering into it. I mean, some of those factors would come into play.
And also, when you're teaching and you're getting more education and your school is paying for it, that is part, the education that they're paying for is to benefit you in your job with the school. So that wouldn't even apply in that if they approve it, they've decided, they deemed that it benefits you in
Right. Right. If they want you to have those skills and they're paying for it, right?
The question is, if they want you to have those skills and they pay for it, and then you turn around and leave. Take those new skills that they paid for and apply them with another business.
And the way we have it written still wouldn't apply, I think, right? Because as long as it would benefit you in your current job, it doesn't matter that it would benefit you also to leave.
Right. I mean, if it's something, you know, you gave the example before of, you know, a safety training or something. If that's something the employer wants you to have, they want you to be the safety officer or whatever. That's part of your job. That's a job skill that they're giving to you. If you then leave to take a safety officer job somewhere else, that's not covered by this. This is more if it's an extra thing, like, again, encouraging employees to improve their education level, or again, develop a skill that they're not required for their job right now. That's the voluntary piece, right? Anytime you're being asked by the employer to get the training or to do it, that's different than making an opportunity available to an employee.
But I would imagine that, let's say you're in your current job and they say, there is this external training where you can get certified to be a safety training officer. It's not required. You can take this and we'll pay for it, but we're going to do a stay or pay agreement to stay a year, or whatever it is. Versus them saying you must take this training.
And then it's voluntary because then you can choose like, okay,
And there's a certificate.
right, if I write a certificate, I can take somewhere else. And and I know that if I leave, I'm going to have to repay the employer $2,000 or whatever the cost is.
That would be, and in that situation, they would have to reveal that up front.
Right. So they would have to, again, this is,
Making that deal.
I think a lot of this is about transparency and making sure people are aware what it is they're agreeing to upfront and not finding out later, oh, by the way, you know, we gave you this training and now you need to pay us back.
So in that situation, a teacher, if they knowingly agree, it's in their contract somewhere, if they have to pay it back or not. Is that it?
Yes.
The abuses that have happened nationwide and are not these kinds of examples. They're things like people working for pet grooming businesses and being told, you know, they're not leaving with any sort of transferable skill or certificate, but being told we trained you and you owe us this amount. I mean, there have been some really egregious situations And again, you're dealing with people that don't have the resources to fight back or, don't have the sophistication to know. So that's really what this is to prevent, is those kind of abuses.
And those kind of positions are not salary positions.
Right. So again, that exempt, having that language in around the non-exempt is helpful in the legislative intent.
And that is 90% of this.
Right.
The committee, we're on the floor at 10, you're at 1. Question?